coming to this conversation. My name is John Witvliet, here from the Worship Institute at Calvin, and as you know, it's our honor to welcome Reverend Dr. Raymond Wise this afternoon. But I'm wondering if we could start by simply having you tell us a little bit about your current work in Bloomington, Indiana, and then hear a little bit about your life journey that led you there, and that can lead us into a conversation about worship music today. So again, welcome to Calvin, and we look forward to hearing a little bit of your story.
Well, thank you again. I'm so glad to be here sharing with you, and I'm so glad to finally be on the Calvin campus after all of these years. We've met, as you know, quite a while ago, and this must be the Kairos moment for us to be together here. Certainly, for many of you know, I am now teaching at the Indiana University in Bloomington. And I'm just excited to be there. Going on my third year there. I am actually wearing several hats there. I am a professor of practice in the African Diaspora Studies Department, and I teach classes in African American sacred music and African American music. Then I am the associate director of the African American Arts Institute, a unique division that they have that actually focuses on the proliferation of African American music and art. They have 3 performing ensembles, one of which is the African American Choral Ensemble. I conduct that ensemble, and that ensemble specializes on performing music composed by, for, or about African Americans. It's a very diverse group, although they perform just African American music. Then I am recently, as I said, some of my responsibilities at IU include now outreach and recruitment and going out to share. So I'm on the road pretty much, clinicking and traveling most of the time, kind of sharing the music. But it's been an interesting story, an interesting journey getting to this place. I'm a 4th generation musician. My great-grandmother was a musician, her husband was a pastor, and I tell this story all the time. They had 6 daughters, 4 of which were musicians, 2 of which were preachers. One was my grandmother, of course, and she had children. One which was my mother, who was also a church musician, gospel musician, and classically trained musician. My mom and my dad had 6 children, 3 older children and 3 younger. I'm in the younger set, and my older brothers and sisters were singing as a trio before we were even born. So as soon as we could talk, we were put into the family group, and we started singing gospel music, kind of like I said, Gospel Jackson 5. You know, in the 60s and 70s. And so the other interesting piece about my family's group, my great aunt was a pioneering radio announcer in the Baltimore, Washington, Annapolis area in the 40s and 50s. And at that time, gospel music was a new music that was evolving. It was just being accepted in the church community. At any rate, she was also a promoter of music. So since gospel music was not really embraced fully in the churches, new gospel artists could not go to churches and perform. So they developed what they called the Gospel Highway, which was a network of churches and places and schools and arenas and homes and restaurants or places where they could travel to share this new music and sing and perform. Well, my aunt, as a promoter, promoted the concerts and the careers of all of these great artists. So you name the artists, from Shirley Caesar to James Cleveland to the Caravans to Albertina Walker to Thomas Dorsey to Rosetta Tharpe to, you know, she was always traveling doing concerts, and she would sponsor these concerts all up and down the East Coast. So my family, we were blessed, and we got to sing and open up for all of these concerts. So pretty much Friday after school, Sunday midnight, we were traveling and singing all the time. And the interesting piece is, in hindsight, I now know that that was real significant because these were stars and famous people. But to us, it was just people we were singing with. You know, it's no big deal. That's James Cleveland and the Caravans. You know, we'd go home and imitate and mock all of them. You know, but I, you know, had no idea that, you know, these were the pioneers of the gospel field. But at any rate, I began doing music very, very early in my life. I started singing, as I said, at 3. I began playing the piano at 4. I was very early in my life. I was in a musical theater, regional theater production, got stage struck for the acting piece there. Started composing at 9, started playing for a church at 12. Had my first recording with my own group at 15. Had my first album with my own choir at 17. And in spite of all the gospel music that was going forth, I committed that I was not going into music. Because you know, everyone says you're going to be broke, get a real career. And you know, the interesting piece is I was gifted in many ways. I can even remember still, even in high school, some of the counselors and administrators saying, you know, you're too smart to be down in the performing arts department, you know, and you need to be in trigonometry, you know, and putting me in all the academic classes. And certainly I had a great time in my academic career through high school, and determined I was going to be an anesthesiologist. And so I went to the Health Magnet High School, and as I shared, it took me about 2 visits to the hospital to realize I am not doing this. I don't want to do this at all. And so I had to struggle with that issue, but I eventually went with my heart instead of my head, because my heart had a passion for music. And while I was trying to deny it just to make money, my heart really wanted to be a minister, even though I didn't fully understand what that meant. So I continued to go down that path. I began to study classical music and got bit by the musical bug, and I said, I'm going to school for music. And the environment in which I grew up in the Baltimore, Washington area. There was a very unique environment that many of the church musicians who played gospel were also classically trained. There were musicians like Richard Smallwood and Henry Davis and Mark Payne, and all of these young gentlemen at this point were mentors that I looked up to as a child who could play gospel music, but they inserted classical cadenzas and all kinds of wonderful technique into the gospel music, and I wanted to be just like them. And the reason that happened in the area is primarily because gospel music was not accepted in the academy. So as these folks who played gospel in churches on Sunday went to school, they were not permitted to play it in the schools, in the practice room, in the halls. In fact, they were forbid to play it. So as a means of trying to create a compromise, they would then create choirs in the community in their churches that performed the total spectrum of music as a means of appeasing and appealing to their music professors and saying, come on, why don't you allow us to do this, because we can do all of these things. So that created a very unique community. So that's who I wanted to be. I want to be one of them. And so as I go off happy, excited to go to school, to undergraduate, I very quickly learned that gospel and classical music didn't mix. And for many reasons, for issues of vocal health primarily, also because the music had not often been included in the curriculum, that people didn't know how to assess it and how to approach it in terms of teaching it. And there were many other issues related to it. But as a result of my desire to be both a gospel and classical musician, I had to fight. It was such a struggle, and there's still a few remnants of wounds that are left. But the positive thing about that was that it burned into me a vision, that there needs to be a place where people can learn about African American gospel music in academic settings and not be made to feel it's inferior to any other musical style. So gospel needs to be included in the academy. So for the last 25 or 30 years, that has been a part of my goal. We literally were blessed to develop a community arts center called the Center for the Gospel Arts in Columbus, Ohio, where for 28 years we just taught classes in all the arts. We looked at every aspect of the arts related to gospel music and developed courses in piano and voice, and we did gospel tap dancing, if you could imagine, and composition and all the various areas, and realizing that even as we went to that area, we still needed to move into the academy. So I went back and I finished my master's, began to work on that, and worked on my doctorate, and found that there were still some attitudes that were still remaining that did not want gospel music in the academy. And it bothered me still, but God was faithful in that while I was there, just as a traditional classical musician, one of my professors came to me one day and said, could you play a gospel piece for me and demonstrate in the class? I'm like, well, I guess. So I played a piece and, I sang for him. He said, that's great. So about 3 weeks later, he came and said, all these schools are developing these gospel choirs. And I don't mean the student-run ones. I mean ones for credit that the students can take for credit. You think we can pull something like that off here at OSU? And I'm on the inside going, yes. But on the outside, I'm like, well, let's see what we can do. Let's see if we can pull this off. And of course, then in 1999, we started the first gospel choir through the School of Music at Ohio State. And it was a wonderful, wonderful blessing. And the choir grew and grew to more than 100, 130 kids or so in the choir. And then the following year, my alma mater invited me back. 20 years later, they were ready to start a gospel choir. And the irony is one of the ladies who suggested me to serve as the conductor did not realize I was the same conductor that was there 20 years prior. And so 20 years later, the way the Lord brought this circle around, I was able to go back to my alma mater and develop a course in gospel music. So from that point, we began to implement courses related to gospel music and African American sacred music in the academy, and working toward developing some kind of credential so that students or people interested in this musical form could go and actually learn how to assess this music. And the wonderful thing is that as the program went forth, you'll find that predominantly more non-African Americans became a part of the choirs and the programming than you did African Americans, in part for several reasons, because many of them who perhaps were not enrolled were not used to acquiring the skill in an academic setting, and then primarily because once people began to figure out it was accessible and not just a gift, but there was a skill that could be taught, then all of a sudden, I want to be a part. So the programs continue to be successful, and as they went forward, again, the doors began to open, the Lord began to open other avenues, and we're now at Indiana, and we're teaching there as well, and just looking forward to the wonderful ways we can make this music accessible and available to those who want to be a part of it.
Terrific. Say a little bit about how this explicitly religious music works in a big secular university campus, and the way that message speaks to the spiritual hungers that can be found in that context.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting piece. Primarily, when you begin to look at the public institution especially, of course, because of the separation of church and state, that's always a key issue. And primarily, it should not speak. However, when you look at most choral music, the majority of it is sacred music. And at some point, something had to come forth to kind of ease this tension. So the National Association for Music Education, formerly MENC, they put together a statement, an eight-point statement, that basically said you must focus on the artistic value of the music rather than the religious or spiritual nature of the music, which gave a license almost to utilize this music inside of the academy. However, I also explained it in a different way. When you begin to look at gospel music, people perform it from different levels and in different perspectives. There are some who look at it as only entertainment. There's some who are looking for educational value, and there's some who are looking for the inspirational value. So I suggest that there are 3 different levels of music performance. Level 1 is music. That's just notes and words. Level 2 is polished music. That's beyond the music and the words. There's the phrasing, the sforzandos, the crescendos, the tenutos, the sandos, making it musically beautiful. But in the gospel realm, I say there's a 3rd level, which is anointed, polished music. And that is that belief that gospel singers that believe that when you sing praises unto God, that the power and presence of God will overshadow what you do. So in a public institution, I say to my kids, I can only demand of you level 2, but I don't mind if you bring your level 3 along. So just have to always be very mindful of where I am, in the setting in which I am, and not going beyond the legal limitations as the professor of record. However, the students can go a little further than I can go, and I'm just trying to create a space and understanding that people come for different reasons. Some come for academic, some come for musical, some come for spiritual, some come just because it's a social place where all the students are. I believe that all those things can occur, and people can draw from the environment what they need.
Now, part of the life story is congregational life, and I'm wondering about the congregations that have formed you. And then also my guess is that that's part of the story of why it's not just Dr. Raymond Wise, but the Reverend Dr. Raymond Wise, right?
Yes.
The ordination that came as part of congregational life. Can you tell us a little part of that and the congregations that formed you along the way?
Yes, absolutely. And the interesting piece, as you start adding on the titles, I talked about the musical legacy within my family, but there's also a legacy of teachers and a legacy of ministers. And just my immediate family, my mother is a pastor. Of my 5 brothers and sisters, 5 of them are ministers, 3 of which are pastors. So the teaching, ministry, preacher, pastor, singing piece did not fall far from the tree. However, we were raised Baptist in a traditional Baptist church, Central Baptist Church in Baltimore, Maryland. However, my mother played for several churches. She played for another Baptist church, which was more of a Pentecostal kind of Baptist church. She also played for an evangelist. Back in the 60s, there was an evangelist by the name of Reverend Gene Ewing. He was out of Dallas, Texas, and he evangelized all over the country. And he came to our city, Baltimore, for several years, and he had a revival that continued to go. So she played for her, and we would often sing, and then he'd travel. We would travel with him as well. So that was a whole kind of European American evangelical kind of experience there. Then, because we sang, we sang in all kinds of churches with all kinds of cultural aesthetics going on. I remember when we talk about the difference between the African and the European cultural aesthetic, even within the African American community, there's a difference in the aesthetics that you'll find in churches. I remember we would go to certain churches and we would go, okay, we're going to the dry church. You know, what did that mean? And we didn't know it as kids. We just knew they didn't clap, they didn't sing, they just sat very quietly. This is an African American church, but you didn't clap, you know. So it was like, okay, we're going to the dry church. And then we'd go to the Pentecostal church, like, oh man, we're going to the fun church with the bass and the guitars, the drum, you know, we're not gonna blow, let this, you know. And so we had such a wealth of exposure to the various kind of churches. And while we were Baptists, there was still a kind of holiness in our upbringing in terms of expecting the Spirit of God, praying and wanting to hear the voice of God and living in a way that was pleasing unto the Lord. So we had all of these influences. Even as a high school student, I was a hired soloist at an Episcopal church. When I was in Vienna, I was at a Catholic church studying. I mean, so many different worship experiences have poured into my life that have come out in my music and my ministry.
And when you think of the last 10 or so years, and you think about ways that church and worship and music life have changed during that time, what stands out to you, surprises that you have experienced in your current travels or work with students? What are some of the, in your mind, big trends or developments that we need to pay attention to in church life today?
I think the greatest thing that has happened is over the last 10, 15 years, worship music has moved outside of the church. There has been a recognition that the music is appealing to a cross-cultural audience or mainstream audience. So the music has gone outside of the church, and in so doing, many of those who produce this music see it as entertainment. So as the music goes out and we see it on TV and we see it on the videos and we see it out in the world, there's this wonderful entertainment factor that everybody is drawn to. But the challenge has been, once we see it out there as entertainment, those inside of the church are also looking at that same music, trying to bring an entertainment type of music into worship. And worship moves from worship to entertainment. So the greatest challenge I think I've seen is the twofold, in that the blessing of the music going forth has also been, in a sense, a challenge of trying to understand that when we bring it back into church for worship, that we must still have a worship ministry mentality. It doesn't mean we cannot use the technology, we cannot use all the advantages of all the wonderful things that come from expanding the music, but once we come to worship, we come to worship. You know, and there is a difference even from worship on Sunday morning and a concert. The sense of giving my heart to God and making God the focal point as we worship, as opposed to perhaps a concert which shows the versatility or virtuosity of the performer as he or she worships. And just the sense that the music has moved out has really challenged us within the church to keep a ministry focus, even though we're using this music that's become so popular.
Can you say a little bit about how you would think about that as a composer or arranger, as well as leading a group in the worship context now? What are the things that you would do or that you would choose not to do in order to really insist on that worship focus?
Right. Well, one thing, as a composer, I teach a course on composition. And what I teach, in terms of these gospel compositions, what I call intent-based composition. You must always know to whom you're serving and to whom you're ministering. And that's one of the challenges. Quite often, today in our services, we get up, we sometimes forget that there are people over 40. And sometimes in church, we forget that there are people under 40. So the idea is, if I'm trying to minister to a particular group, and I'm not aware of that group and what the needs are and what their specific joys and sorrows may be, I may miss the ministry moment because I'm thinking about myself. So as a writer and as a composer, I'm always asking the question, who, what, when, where, and why? Even from the performance standpoint or the ministry standpoint of sharing as a choir or director, conductor, who, what, when, where, why? Is this the contemporary service? Is this the traditional service? Are these older people? Are they younger people? What are those things that would feed them? So whenever I'm writing, it always starts with the question, to whom am I ministering? And let alone, is this something that will minister to God? That's the first who. And how does, as we please him, happen to move into the other areas to please others? As Paul said, I made all things to all men that I might by all means win some. So we know we have the flexibility to adjust and to adapt and to become different and use the diversity that's within us, but it must be used in the right context, in the right way, so that it appeals and draws rather than drives.
I think what a wonderful service-oriented approach, but I think what intentionality that takes. One of the things I'm thinking about is the challenge of working with what some people refer to as the worship industry, right? And the way that recordings and certain published music publication outlets may not always have that servant's heart out there. And say a little bit about your experience of the industry side of worship music today,
absolutely.
And the opportunities, but also some of the challenges that you experience.
Absolutely. I can attest to this personally, as well as many of my friends. As we've had that kind of service ministry heart, I saw that from home. I saw it with my grandmother. I saw it with my mother. It was always about ministry. It was always about seeking, the place where God's anointing was flowing. And as we began to do music, there were people who were drawn to out-gift, but they didn't want out-God. So the interesting piece is, as we began to get national recordings and contracts, we had a ministry heart. We wanted to minister. We would sing and we'd minister. We'd try to make sure that people could see God, and we'd even do invitations and call people to come to give their lives to God. The recording companies didn't want that. No preaching. We don't want all this ministry. We don't want you to do that. And it came to a point that we actually had to make decisions. We can't do this anymore. We can't be a part of the industry because our heart is a heart of ministry. And if you're telling us that we're singing gospel music, singing about God, and a God who can deliver and change and heal, but we can't tell you about him, then this is not where we want to be. So it's been a challenge for us. Over the years, the Lord told us to just kind of do the ministry on our own. We've had certain struggles financially, trying to do things and making things happen because we wanted to keep that servant's heart, that ministry place of service. But God has been faithful that we have still been able to minister and do what we can with the resources that we have. But that's very important. But some of my friends, they decided it was more important to have the contract. So they're out there, I could call names, and you would know them because they're very, very famous, but you're not going to hear and see the same kind of ministry going forth because they made a purposeful choice where the industry says, we don't want that because we want you to have an appeal to folks who don't believe what you're singing. So we just want to put it out in a way so that everybody can see it as entertainment, they can spend their money, make us a lot of money, but they don't really want to hear about God. So they want the gift, but not the God.
Bless you for the resistance that's built in there to that. That's wonderful. One of your publications is focuses on spirituals, right? 21 spirituals for the 21st century.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about that and about the historical resonances that you're eager to promote? And a little bit about how that rich tradition of material, your experience of it being received in the spectrum of churches today.
Yes. Well, let's go back and talk about the spiritual, and then we can kind of pull it together. The spiritual is considered by most scholars as one of the first authentic American music to develop here in the country. As you know, prior to the slaves coming to America, or the Africans coming to America as enslaved people, psalmody and line singing, those things came from Europe with the Puritans and Pilgrims and so forth. However, when the slaves got here, they began to continue to sing the African songs, which were misunderstood. So their master said, don't sing those songs because we don't know what they are. But they didn't realize that when they sang these songs, they were not just songs to praise God, they were not just songs to communicate, but they were work songs. So when they stopped singing the songs, their productivity waned, and it went down 80%. So they said, what's going on? Why are you not producing? It's because we were not singing. So they said, okay, sing, but sing something different. So out of that inhumanity, if you will, to man, as Langston Hughes says, comes this wonderful music. And they created a new song called the spiritual. And as the spiritual develops and evolves, it evolves in so many directions that affects all of American music. At least 5 directions. It evolves in a secular direction, which becomes the blues, which goes to jazz and ragtime and rock and roll. In a theatrical direction, which then goes to minstrelsy through the vaudeville, then the musical theater. It goes in artistic direction, where it's used for the concert stage, where you have the art song spiritual accompanied by piano and orchestra with the classical bel canto vocal style. Then it goes in academic direction, where we get the concert spiritual, which is the formal spiritual for choirs in the bel canto style, the a cappella spiritual, and that that then evolves into quartets, which you don't also think about when you think about the spiritual, but then it evolves a sacred direction, which then went into the congregational spiritual, which primarily worked in the Pentecostal churches and the Azusa movement and that whole place where they began adding small percussion and drums and piano to the spiritual. And that eventually moves into gospel music. So the spiritual then has affected all of American music, and there's a parallel development between European American and African American music by what I call adopt and adapt. Because these two cultures have interacted and interpenetrated, they often adopt each other's musical forms and adapt them in another way. So when you look at almost any African American style, there's probably also a European American parallel that matches it all the way down in both sacred and secular. So as we come on down and we get through Emancipation Proclamation, there are two trends of thought in the African American community. One says, now that we're free, let's go back to the African way and do everything with all of the emotionalism. The other mindset says, now that we're free, we must do everything according to the European aesthetic and remove ourselves from the Africanisms, including the spiritual. Well, as a result of that, many people decide not to do the spiritual. I think of the Fifth Jubilee singers, for example, who were trying so hard to raise money for the university by singing just traditional choral, European choral music. They weren't as successful. But once they began to sing the spirituals, people began to really donate money, and they raised a significant amount of money. So they began to add European choral harmonies and the oral spiritual and develop the concert spiritual. So it became very, very popular. It was the height of its popularity as you move into the 1900s. And then as we moved into the 70s, 80s, 60s, late 60s, 70s, and 80s, they began to wane in popularity. At the end of the century, the 20th century, a gentleman by the name of Moses Hogan came forth, and he began rearranging some of these spirituals and began to bring them back into popularity. And as you may know, he died very early, unexpected, 2004, I believe. And at that same time, the year he died, we released our recording of 21 spirituals for the 21st century. So many of my friends who were friends of his as well say, okay, you've got this mantle, you've got to take this forth. But what's so significant about them is the slaves learned very early, if I can keep a song in my heart, I can make it through anything. And it seems that in today's society, we've stopped singing. So the point in bringing these spirituals back is to say, let's keep a song in our heart. The slaves knew that through these songs, they had a hope that life would be better. And even if they didn't see it in this life, they believed they would see it in the next life when they got to heaven. So by revitalizing these spirituals, not only are we bringing back a choral style that has been lost, but hopefully there's a message that the students and those who sing them will take with them that will encourage them that it's going to be better, that you will get there and you will get to a better life and things will work out in the end. So that's what's so exciting about trying to revitalize them, because this generation, for many of them, they've never been exposed. So just bringing it back in a way that really gives them another opportunity to say, this is a musical form that will help you when you're feeling like, I need a little assistance, or I need a little help, or I need a little bit of hope. Sing one of these.
Yeah, so say then, that's interesting about the mix of old and new that you think is crucial for worship music ministry.
Yes.
Because this is really a reclamation project and that reaches deep into the heritage. Say a little bit about the mix, old and new, that you...
Well, absolutely. One thing, my doctoral dissertation is in the history of African American gospel music. It was sparked primarily around 2000. A young man by the name of Kirk Franklin released this song called Stomp. When this song came out, it just caused havoc within the church community, especially the black church community. It was like, this is not gospel, this is devil music, this is awful, because they were on TV with videos and gyrating and jumping and hip-hop dancing, and it was like, this is awful, this is not church music. So it sparked the question of what is gospel? And as I began to ask the question, I began to look at current definitions that didn't define the older music. I began to look at older definitions, and that didn't define the new contemporary music. So I had to go all the way back to the beginning of the history and began to look through the history. And as I searched through, I found that there was an historical pattern, and it is this. Someone comes to the church with a style that's considered too secular, too bluesy, too jazzy, new, different. Church doesn't like it. They reject it. Well, while they reject it, the secular world embraces it, and they make a lot of money. So someone in the church takes that style, continually tweaks it with traditional elements, And they finally get it to a point that the church says, okay, we can accept this. This is all right. They take it to a peak, and then bam, here comes someone else doing that again. Well, if you're aware of this historical pattern, this has happened 5 times in the history of gospel music, but it's happened a zillion times in the history of church and Christian music. So what happens is often we're always fighting about what's new, not realizing that this is a historical pattern that goes on all the time. It's just telling us that it's a new season, it's a new generation, something is going on. So once we learn that this pattern starts coming and people start getting upset and they start saying this is the devil music and this is not right, I think of psalmody, and line singing. When they went from line singing, doing every line at a time, to what they called regular singing, doing it straight through without stopping, people walked out of the church, this is devil music, this is just awful. Well, once we know those kinds of things exist, then we can move the fight to a different level. Not is this new or is this old, but is there fruit? Is there ministry? Is this meeting the needs of the contemporary age? So, as we begin to look at the old music and the new music, the traditional and the contemporary wars, we've got to understand that we now are living in a day that we must be relevant. And when we're irrelevant, we're going to lose the people. So that's probably one of the greatest challenges I think we have today, is the preparedness for our music ministries to approach 21st century ministry. 50 years ago, most of our churches were homogeneous, where everybody was the same. You had 3 classes of churches, especially in the African American community, it was like this: low economic means, moderate economic means, high economic means. Little or no education, moderately educated, highly educated. Lots of emotion, little emotion, no emotion. You knew the churches were like that. So you knew, like I said, we were going to the dry church today, or we're going to the Holy Roller church today. So we knew where it was. But what's happening today is everybody's mixed up. So the bank presidents, with the janitor, with the beautician, with the lawyer, with the doctor, everyone's sitting on the same pew, coming from different perspectives, different backgrounds, having different musical tastes, and we dare get up with one musical style, assuming that all of these people are going to like our personal preference. So our challenge is the preparedness to understand that we now have such a diverse community of congregants that we cannot serve them with one thing. So if that means a contemporary service and a traditional service, if that's what it means, then amen, glory to God. If you have a choir that can do all of it in one service, then amen, glory to God. If it means that there's a special kind of service we need to have on Fridays or Saturday nights for the young people or another group, then glory to God. But we've got to become all things to all men, that we by all means reach them all, and the music is a wonderful tool and gift that we have to reach them.
Which makes me think of the aspiring church musician who really has to learn all things. And I think of the folks who design training programs for church musicians who have to aspire to teach aspiring church musicians all things. And what a blessing, but what a huge challenge there is along the way. Can you say a little bit about that? Advice that you'd have to people who are thinking about becoming musical leaders in congregations, and how to go about acquiring the skills and the qualities of heart that are needed to serve so many different musical forms, styles, really all at the same time.
Right, absolutely. Well, the interesting piece is, in terms of the educational process, I advocate what I call a total music philosophy. Of course, learning all the musical styles. And that can only happen as you're exposed to all the musical styles. So if you determine, this is what I like, this is only what I like, I'm going to stay in this place. If the place in which you serve only requires that and that's all you need, then that might work for you. But if you're going to work pretty much as today's world is, in a very diverse society, you're going to need to know a little more than what you know. So it all goes back to the training programs that we develop. One of my challenges, especially as an undergraduate, and still in many places, there is a sense that only a particular musical style is worthy of study in the academy. And the only issue with that is when your students go out to teach, they are not either well prepared to teach anything beyond that, or they don't have the skills to be able to move beyond what they've been trained. So if we can start at the academy and say, listen, how can we implement and bring some things in? And don't bring them in just as a favor. Well, we're doing you a favor and letting you have a gospel choir, or letting you have a bluegrass ensemble, and letting you have a gamelan ensemble here because we think it's inferior, but we're going to bring it in. No, bring it in because these things are very important, and they may speak to a group that your music may not may not resonate with. So as we begin to develop our curriculum and our programming, it's important that we find a way to include everyone. Once I did a paper on what I call the missing constituent curriculum, whereas we know there's certain parts of the canon, but we leave some seats open at the table. So if someone comes in from a certain community or environment, we need to honor the cultural capital that they bring. You know, this happens often with gospel musicians, that they are wonderfully esteemed, highly esteemed in the churches, and they want to go to school for music, but they've not had the kind of preparation that they need to be successful in traditional music school. So once they get in, what's happened is everything that they've known is totally dismissed and disregarded, rather than saying, let's honor what you bring, figure out where you are, and how can we grow that and prepare you to get the other. And what happens is because we often dismiss them, then they build a wall and don't want the other. So the need for them, or the ability for them to become that kind of total musician that does it all, it gets cut off because they're not celebrated, they're tolerated. So it's very important that as we look at this sense of preparation and training, we first find a way to make that happen. Now, to the young aspiring musician, I would say, first of all, start where you are. I talk about the 4 Ds out of that scripture, 1 Timothy 14 to 16, 14 to 16. It says, neglect not the gift that was in thee, that was given thee by the laying on of presbytery. You know, meditate upon this, devote thyself wholly to this, that thy prophecy may appear to all, and doing this, you know, continue doing this, and as you do this, you won't save both thyself and them that hear thee. At any rate, I get from that the 4 Ds principle: discover, develop, display, and draw. So the idea is they know they have a gifting, and that's wonderful. But many times we're ready to go from discover to display. But you got to go through develop. So if we can teach our young folks, if you know you have a gift, don't just go out and assume that you're great and you can do everything and you can't be taught. Go and develop. Go and study. Make it better. Be the best you can be. Then after you've developed, then it's time to display. And if you display with excellence, then the 4th D is draw, which means that God can draw people back to himself through the use of your gift. And even if you're in settings where you can't say the name of God, you can't say the name of Christ, you know, if there is a light and a powerful anointing on what you do, somebody's going to know something is different. So start where you are. Start with the things that are available and accessible, and find teachers. Perhaps you can't afford to get into a university. Well, you know, what church is down the street? What friends do you have around the corner? Where can you go and just listen? Where can you go to another workshop? Find the things that are accessible. Now with YouTube, now with books that are being printed, there's so many ways that you can at least start on your own. And then as you begin to find other resources, you can begin to move into ways where you can get the kind of skills that will grow your skills in other areas as well.
Say a little bit about those of us who are mid-career, perhaps, and we wish we were more musically multilingual, but it's hard to learn a new musical language mid-career. What advice would you give to people like those of us in that category?
Well, I'd say, first of all, it's never too late, but you must find a bridge. You must find a liaison. Many times, even many of my friends in the academy, choral directors, have confessed to me one of the reasons that they have not done gospel music and permitted it is because they didn't feel they could do it authentically. One thing that the academy has done, they focus so much on authenticity that is one of the reasons that non-Western music is often not included, because conductors don't feel they can do it authentically, so they'd rather not do it at all. But what has happened is, if you can find someone who is transparent, who is open, who is a willing teacher, who says, let me teach you, let me help you, let me show you, somebody is probably willing to share with you the wonderful gift that they have, just as much as you then can in turn share with them the wonderful gift that you have as well. So just finding a bridge, finding a connector that can help you to access the world. And if it's somebody who you trust and you build relationship, you can share both ways, and you can find that you can easily access some of this new music, even, you know, later in your career. It's never too late. And what we have purposed to do is try to develop the kind of resources that literally put it in an accessible form, to make a curriculum, make a pedagogy, make a methodology, especially for those who don't come from our tradition, so that they then can go step by step and they can access the tradition.
One of the amazing things on YouTube is that when you type in Raymond Wise and look at all of the different recordings, which, as you were sharing with me beforehand, have been put up by other people, the range of types of congregations and organizations, the cultural background of these, they come from such a remarkable range. You've been in a lot of places and been a bridge for many different people. Say a little bit about the reception of African American gospel music beyond the African American community, both here but also internationally, which is really quite a remarkable story in the past decade.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I don't know how I answer, because it's I answer with many, many different sides. Let me go this way. When you begin to talk about African American culture and music, I shared early in the class today that when people think of African American music, they generally think of music or any part of the culture that's related to Africa. But what they've got to acknowledge is that when Africans came from Africa and brought their culture, it collided with European culture. So when these two cultures came together, they created something new, which was African American culture. So as a result of that, African Americans then can manifest their cultural behavior completely from the African side to completely to the European aesthetic side and anything in between. So often, many times, even African Americans sometimes stereotype each other because they don't realize that within the community itself, people have been raised and socialized and groomed according to the different aesthetics. So when we begin to talk about the response, there are clearly some differences. In fact, the African and the European aesthetics are diametrically opposed. They're totally opposite. So, for example, in the African aesthetic, there is freedom. In the European aesthetic, there is permission. So when we talk about the sense of reception to this music, my choir, which sings recording group, we began traveling. I remember we started traveling in non-African American community and churches. We would begin to sing, and we'd get up, we're singing our hearts out, sweating and, going and, emotionally excited. And if we're in a European American congregation, they would just sit very quietly and look at us and would not move. So we're like, okay, are we bad? Do they hate us? Is it awful? What's going on here? And then, you go to a black church, and they're screaming and hollering and shouting all over the place, like, okay, so it must be all right. But what we realized was that in the European tradition, you must have permission. It is performer observed. You are taught to listen respectfully. But when it's over, oh my God, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard. I mean, you guys are wonderful. The receiving line is where you get the excitement. In the black church, it's all throughout the performance because there is freedom to perform. So what we learn is that we must give permission before the concert and show them. And so in many of my concerts, I'll get the audience, how many folks, for instance, the first time you're in a gospel concert, stand up on your feet. Let me show you how to rock. Let me show you how to clap. Let's do some singing. Let's do some improvisation. We give them the tools, and then throughout the whole concert, they're singing, they're clapping. And even when I'm overseas with groups there, I'll get them up, we'll get them rocking, we'll get them clapping, and give them the tools to respond in a way that's appropriate for this style. But on the contrary, when you're then going into an African American worship setting where you're trying to do more European choral classical music, and you don't want them screaming, you've got to give them instruction to say, okay, in this song, will you just listen quietly and, let the music pour over your souls and just feel the music or something. In other words, don't scream through this piece, right? In that regard, the reception is really wonderful, and especially once people are given permission to really fully enjoy the experience, it becomes another level of appreciation, because then they see that, oh, I can do this too. It's permitted and permissible to clap and to rock and to sing along. It's instrument inclusive, so it's wonderful.
But so then what I'm hearing is the bridge making, it's not just the notes that are played, right? It's also in the preparation of those who will receive the music. That's a big lesson, really, right across the cultural spectrum and stylistic spectrum.
Absolutely. But that's really the whole challenge of our church in 21st century. As we're now coming together, you're finding our churches are, like I said, no more homogeneous. Everybody's all mixed up together. We often find that we don't understand each other. Why are they singing that song? Or I don't like that style, or I don't like this piece, or I don't like that piece. Not understanding that different cultures have different things that they value. When we begin to look at this, the aesthetics and their perspectives and their worldviews, different things are valued. And until we get to understand what is considered beautiful on the other side, then we won't understand and appreciate the beauty. Even if it's not our preference, we'll then understand what is beautiful. But then we then have the tools to say, now that I understand what you like, I now can come and speak your language, and I can meet you where you are, then help you to come over and understand something else, just as you can come over and you can take what you have and bring that over to the other side as well. So it just gives us a wonderful tool to begin to bring everyone together.
Are there some particular examples of music that has really been especially effective as bridge builder. I think, for example, Robert Ray's Gospel Mass was performed here in about 1986, and the beautiful way that created a bridge. Are there other examples that stand out in your mind over the past decade or so of songs that have been bridge songs, either in your own work or in a larger
Robert
context?
Ray's Gospel Mass, of course, is a wonderful piece. We've done that, overseas and here. I mean, it's just a wonderful piece because, again, it takes two worlds: the Catholic Mass and the gospel style, pulling two things together and creating something new that gives understanding on both sides. But there are many pieces like that. I'm thinking of a piece like Total Praise by Richard Smallwood. Rich, of course, is a gospel musician, but you hear all the classical music influence in his music, which gives an ear to those who like Western European classical music, but you hear the style and the phrasing and interpretation from the gospel style, which puts it all together. Let me share this, and this might bring some understanding. I shared it with the students earlier. When you begin to think about this middle place of coming together, for many years as a musician, I felt like I never fit. I felt like I never really had a place. I was always very frustrated as a musician. I was raised, had a lot of wonderful experience, grew up with a lot of wonderful musicians, and as I'd look at my friends, it was always like they were doing greater things. They were doing bigger things. It's like, I'd get a contract, but they got a contract. It's like I'd go overseas, but they went overseas, I'm like, well, God, what's up with that? We know each other, we're raised together, I'm playing for them, why is everything different? Well, there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Robert Mitchell Simmons, and a mentor that changed my life. And in fact, I am who I am in teaching, even as I am, as a result of his influence on me, his mentoring. Well, at any rate, he was the dean of the academic division of the Gospel Music Workshop of America, one of the largest gospel conventions in the world. Well, at any rate, he moved to Columbus, Ohio, where I was living, and began pastoring a church there and teaching at the seminary. So I was on the faculty, so we connected. He said, come on, Raymond, come on, accompany me, bring your choir when I'm lecturing, and you guys can demonstrate, da-da-da. So we began to travel. Well, one day, he was lecturing at the seminary on cross-cultural music. And he said, back in the day, when two cultures came together, A being dominant culture, European, culture, European American music, and then B being African American, whenever two things came together, A, B, it would just be A, B, B, A, two things in the same room. But he began to say of how the cultures now have begun to mix so that now when they come together, it's neither A nor B, it was something new. And he called that new thing C. And when I heard that, I went home and I began to think on that, and the Lord said, that's your problem. You're a C. And I went back and thought about it. All of my background was gospel. All of my training was European classical. So what was coming out of me was neither one or the other. It was a combination of both. So when I go to the B folks, they go, that's nice, but it's to that. Then I go to the A folks, and they go, that's nice, but it's to that. I'm like, well, God, what in the world? Where do I fit? He says, I'm preparing you for a C world. I'm going to need some people who speak both languages, who can become the bridges to bring the body together. So I'm like, okay, fine. I know who I am now. That's cool. So for the last 10, 15 years, literally, that's all I've been doing. I'm going into A environments who want to be exposed to B and speaking their language and bringing B to them. I'm going into B environments who want to be exposed to A, speaking their language and bringing A to them, but then bringing people together that would not normally come together because you now have a bridge or conduit to which they can plug into to make these things happen. And the irony, when I look at all the choirs that I've been blessed to do at the academies, from OSU to Denison to IU, they are all very diverse groups. And I'd say maybe 60, sometimes even to 70, 80% non-African American, because we're able to create a way that people can come in and assess it. So the whole notion of accessibility and coming together, it's really just a matter of learning what the language is and being able to become an interpreter and to translate so that you can bring people into a community and a common place that might not otherwise come together.
Beautiful. Many of us might be think of everyone here and everyone who might be listening to us online. A lot of folks who will be listening online who are from an A world or a B world, however we think of those, and eager to move toward a C world, and looking for the right ways to pull off that transition. What are the kinds of experiences that you would recommend that would help congregations make that transition?
Well, I think one of the first things is to acknowledge where you are. Most of my teaching that I do basically in this area is a result of Dr. Simmons. Dr. Simmons was an African American preacher. Actually, his degree was in education. He was a teacher. And he was called to the ministry and went back to a United Methodist seminary. And then he eventually was ordained to the ministry and to pastor and so forth. And you know, the United Methodist system, they assign you to a church. So this African American, they assigned to a predominantly white church in Dayton, Ohio. So of course, coming out of a Black Baptist church tradition, now going through United Methodist church seminary, being assigned to a predominantly white United Methodist church, he has a vision of what worship should be. And so does the congregation who's been there for 50, 60, 70, 80 years. So all of a sudden, all these questions start arising about, well, what is worship? What is African American worship? What is it that I'm looking at? Why are these things different? Why are we fighting and fussing over all of these things? And this is where he began to establish, oh, there are these distinctions. There are these differences. And he put together a whole process, what he called the journey toward inclusion. The whole notion of disillusion, you know, where you don't do the process at all, for going through pluralism and eventually getting to synergy and synthesis where the A and B becomes C. So you can have big A's, small b's, big B's, small b's, big A, big A, big A, I mean, all of these, you know, mathematical formulas, if you will, where he literally shows how in coming together many times in our worship experiences, we're all in the same place, but we're not really coming together. And as he began to look at the notion of bringing together the cultures and creating something new, at some point, everybody sacrifices something to create something new if you're really going to become a C or somebody who comes together in the middle. But otherwise, what happens is people acknowledge, first of all, where you are, and then acknowledge the desire to be different or to have more. And then again, that conduit. What are the opportunities that are available to be exposed to A or to be exposed to B, and where is a safe place? You've got to find a safe place where you can let down your guard and admit, I don't know something. And that's the hardest thing, the fear of saying, I don't know, but I want to know. And if you can get in a safe place where you feel that and you find a person who's open and transparent and willing to share, that's where you start. Even here at the Institute, you've done so many workshops. There's so many symposiums you've done. There's so many conferences and workshops and clinics all over the country. As you see some things that are interesting, you know, I'd like to learn about that. Well, sign up. You know, maybe you'll be the only person like you in that place. Well, go ahead anyway. Guess what? You'll live, you'll survive, and you might just learn something. And you may be equipped with a few more tools in your tool belt that you can use as you go back and expand your thinking, but then also become an ambassador to expand the thinking of others in your community.
Great. Let me ask one more question, then we'll open it up to the group here. And it relates to the question of different approaches to the voice. So it's a little more technical musical question. In ways, vocal formation, you were referring earlier to those different stylistic expressions and the way that the voice is formed for that. Talk a little bit about what you've learned about vocal formation as it relates to multiple styles, and really what it takes to train students for participating in across the stylistic spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing when I look at vocal training, I've been very blessed in that I was raised, as I said, in the gospel tradition, but I also was blessed to study traditional bel canto classical technique. And the irony is, I never studied voice formally until I got to college. Now, mind you, I had albums and music and traveling all over the world and da-da-da-da. But when I got to college, my teacher said, "You're singing all wrong." I'm like, you're not talking to me. I got albums, you know, I'm singing just fine, you know. Well, at any rate, it took me at least 2 or 3 years. I'd go to class and like she had me doing this weird, whatever. And I wouldn't pay any attention, so, you know, I didn't get it. I wasn't trying to get it because I'd go out on the weekend, sing and do whatever I wanted to do, and then come back, oh, you know, I don't feel well today, my voice is gone, you know, I'm sick, you know, whatever. And she knew. But my teacher, even at that point, she was saved, and she said, well, you know, Ray, I'm just praying for you that the Lord will just get you to settle. And, you know, so I'm like, yeah, you can pray if you want. I'm going to sing like I want to sing. You go on and pray, you know. So at any rate, I was blessed. I studied overseas. I studied in Vienna, Austria. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to study with a teacher there, and it clicked. It was like, oh, this is what she was trying to get me to do. And it's like all of a sudden, it opened up all this wonderful world of now, you know, I'm a countertenor, so all the upper head voice and all this stuff was available to me because I learned to sing and apply that technique. And then it dawned on me, wait a minute. I'm still able to sing in the style that I want to, but now I'm doing it in a more healthy way. So I realized that there are some tools and techniques on the European bel canto classical style that I can implement into my gospel singing. But I also understand that the passion and the emotion and the energy and excitement that came from the gospel side that's often missing on the other side, I could bring that piece to the other side. So I was blessed to develop a technique in teaching gospel singers how to sing authentically, but basically using traditional bel canto technique, but showing them how to implement that into gospel singing. So that's very different, that's very unusual, but that's what I recommend because you want to add longevity to your vocal life. So while gospel singers sing, as you hear them singing with the growls and the shouts and the hollers and the screams, that is absolutely correct. Because gospel is based upon the African aesthetic, which prefers the coarse, the rough, the hoarse, the shouts, the growls, and screams, but singing that way is not absolutely healthy. So if you continue to sing in that way, you may do damage to the voice, in fact, and your voice will certainly decline over time. But if you can learn then to apply correct technique and use that, I'd say 80% of the time, I call it the on the path, off the path technique. You know, sing correctly as much as you can. And then sometimes stylistically, where singing correctly is just not in the style, you just got to go off and well, go off, and when you get done, get back on the path, and get back on good technique, do whatever you got to do. But the point is, you're really trying to do it in moderation so you can get the style, but keep everything nice and healthy and free and open. And you'll sing for a long time, and that's the goal.
Lifelong vocal
Yes,
health is
absolutely.
great. Comments, questions to follow up the conversation that we've been on here today? From anyone? Don't be bashful. Go ahead.
You talked about how you've served in a lot of different kinds of churches and prepared services and everything. I was just wondering, what is your process for doing that? Like, what are the questions that you ask when you're saying, I want to minister to this specific group of people?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, from church to denomination, quite often they will have a format. So what you can do is basically where you're ministering, and for the last 12 years, I've not been a minister of music because I've been now in the academy doing a different thing. But prior to that, for over 20 years, I was a minister of music with my brother, who's a minister, brilliant minister, Harvard graduate, that whole piece. But he often said, you expect what you inspect. So he was one of those kind of, everything in place, and I want this, and I want these things, and da-da-da-da. And he always wrote all the Sunday school literature for us, so we knew every scripture for every Sunday for 6 months at a time, and da-da-da. So he wanted every song to match, he wanted everything to line up. So he was kind of anal in that way, but that was the kind of preparation that let me know I need this. As a minister of music, even with all the choirs, they would give me a list of all their repertoire. I would give them, these are scriptures for the day, what do you have that matches this? I mean, we really purpose to make sure that everything lined up in that way. But the other side is even when you're not looking at being as, as scripted and structured in that way, there's still a sense that there is a format that's usually used within the worship. And then there is a spirit. There's a saying we say, there is no division in the spirit. Have you ever noticed sometimes in worship where perhaps you didn't get a chance to coordinate with the preacher or the pastor or someone else, but all of a sudden you all sing the right songs or you do the right scriptures and it all just lines up. So even when you can't quite figure it out, you still have to think of that vertical connection and says, okay, God, what are you saying now? So even if you don't connect, you can listen to that spirit. And even though it may seem like kind of weird, if you're feeling and hearing that voice right, it'll lead you to the right thing at that particular moment. So the idea is being very aware of your minister, of your pastor, of the format, and what they're trying to accomplish. And with that, you will know then who are the congregants. Is this the traditional service? Is this the contemporary service? Is this the real young people? Is this the babies? Is this the seniors? So you're very aware that certain hymns have certain relevance, certain ones do not. For example, Amazing Grace. When we grew up in this Baptist church, there was a lady named Sister Mary Green. She sat on the second row. She was a deaconess. And so we knew that when we sang Amazing Grace, that by the time you get through many dangers, toils, and snails I have already gone, she was going to shout, woo, Jesus, woo, right? And we were going to laugh because we sitting there waiting, counting down. Okay, 10, here come 9, 8, and woo, hat would go flying, and she's shouting over the bench, right? We knew that. Well, at 10, 12, 13, we thought it's funny. But at 53, it's like, through many dangers, toils, and snares, move over, Sister Green, I'm going to shout with you. So the idea is realizing that at different ages and different places, what we want to present will be different. So the audience to whom we're ministering, as well as the format of the church and what the goals are. And you always hopefully want to be in line with who your leader is. Whoever the pastor or the shepherd or the visionary person is, you always want to be in line with what their vision is. And sometimes it doesn't always match with what you want to do, but we want to match, and we hopefully what God says and what they say, hopefully they will line up. And but you still want to be obedient. You want to be obedient to those who have rules, so they can serve with joy. You know, and but always being aware of where you are, to whom you're serving, and what the vision of the house is. And if you line up with that, you'll pretty much be in good shape.